Туман седой, идет конвой, растаял берег за кормой. Прощай, жена, встречай, волна, а за волнами ждет война. Родной Британии холмы, дождитесь нас, вернемся мы. А ты плесни, шепни, волна, кого из нас возьмет война.
In the early morning of the 7th of September 1941, the Russian military airfield Vaenga 1, located only 40 kilometers from the battlefield, was getting ready to welcome not Nazi German bombers, but 24 British Hurricane fighter planes. At the same time, over there, far out to sea, 33 degrees above the meridian, the aircraft carrier HMS Argus was maneuvering at full speed against the wind, just to give a chance for the Hurricanes to take off. That is how the first ever joint military mission of the British and Soviet air forces began. The deck of the aircraft carrier was not designed for Hurricanes to take off, and the pilots had no experience in taking off from a deck. The ramp also added difficulties. A steeply inclined one, a meter high, was at the end of the deck. The first Hurricane demolished his landing gear on the ramp, and it almost ended up in the sea. Just above the water, the pilot managed to straighten out the plane and climb to the sky. The pilot of the second aircraft saw what happened, but could do nothing. He barely managed, but he kept the plane in the air.
It was a little difficult because it was a very small carrier. We had 350 feet.
To be truthful, the event was somehow dampened by the fact that the orchestra who had to perform the anthem God Save the King forgot about their duties. Along with others, their mouths wide open, they watched as the first Hurricane landed on its belly without undercarriage. There just wasn't any. Behind the first plane, raising fountains of dirt, the second plane belly landed. Fortunately, the remaining 22 aircraft landed normally. The Hurricane airplane carried the brunt in the battle for Britain. Now this fighter must help the Soviet Union to survive its most difficult period of the war. The night of the 22nd of June 1941 was extremely quiet for the British Isles. In the skies over England, there was not a single German aircraft. At 3:30 a.m., a call from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs awakened John Colville, the Executive Secretary to Churchill. Germany had attacked the Soviet Union. Churchill listened to the news and ordered to inform the BBC that he would address the nation over the radio that night.
Any man or state who fights against Nazism will have our aid. We shall give whatever help we can to Russia and to the Russian people. Any technical or economic assistance which is in our power and which is likely to be of service to them.
After learning about the attack on the Soviet Union, Churchill was relieved as Hitler had turned his troops to the east. It meant the fear of invasion of Britain may rest for a while. He wagered the Russians would fight to the end. Churchill would do anything to help. His long-standing dislike of the Bolsheviks notwithstanding, the Prime Minister replied, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." On the first day of the Soviet war, two pilots of the 72nd Mixed Aviation Regiment of the Northern Fleet Air Force, Vasily Volovikov and Boris Safanov, took off to intercept a German bomber in the skies above the Rybyachi Peninsula. The two pilots opened fire from long range and continued shooting until they had run out of ammunition. But the smoking Junkers managed to escape in the clouds. On the same evening, Safanov took white paint and a brush and wrote the abbreviation for the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks on the side of his fighter. On the left side, the inscription read, "Death to Fascists." Everyone knew it was not in the nature of Boris Safanov to give empty promises. Boris Safanov, a Kachin military pilot school graduate, he joined the Northern Fleet in 1939. Since June 1941, he'd been the squadron commander of the 72nd Mixed Aviation Regiment. Persistent, thorough, modest, he had outstanding organizational skills. On the 24th of June, Safanov in his Russian I-16 fighter took off to intercept a German reconnaissance plane, a Ju-88 Junkers. Approaching the plane at close range, Safanov shot it down at his first attempt. When a Soviet boat approached the enemy's aircraft crash site, they picked up only a rubber boat and a parachute. The first success in the air. Safanov is the hero of the day. And not only on this day. He was everyone's favorite, this typical Ruski from near Tula. An excellent, strong-willed pilot. We mustn't lose sight of him. And to encourage people to learn from him. We need more such flyers. Safanov's victory had the most unexpected consequences. Discovering that all overseas German planes were equipped with rubber boats, the commander of the Northern Fleet, Admiral Golovko, said, "It's necessary to adopt what is useful," and he ordered to equip all Russian aircraft flying over the sea with inflatable rescue equipment. Murmansk is the northern gateway to the Atlantic. This port never freezes, even in the cold of -50 degrees centigrade. It's no coincidence that in the First World War, Tsarist Russia received military aid from England and America through Murmansk and Archangel, in total about 1 million tons of cargo. Hitler believed that history could not repeat itself. Murmansk must be captured early in the campaign. 2 months before the start of Operation Barbarossa, the Führer met with General Edward Dietl, the commander of the Norway Mountain Corps. It was this corps that was responsible for the seizure of Murmansk. Hitler knew little about war in the Arctic. Dietl tried to vividly describe the problems and the difficulties they would face.
Tundra
stretches 100 kilometers around Murmansk. This barren area of cliffs and scree slopes, cut by countless rivers and lakes. In summer, the tundra becomes a marsh inhabited by mosquitoes and midges. In the winter, an ice desert with snowstorms. It's a hell on earth, and it's better not to fight there. Nonsense, my dear Dietl. You can easily overcome these ridiculous 100 kilometers, Hitler said, giving the order to launch an advance on the 28th of June 1941. The main role in the support of the Mountain Corps naturally was assigned to aviation. On the 28th of June 1941 in the far north, simultaneously with the rapid advancement of the Mountain Corps under General Dietl's command by land, the Luftwaffe began massive airstrikes. Lack of Soviet fighter planes was compensated for by the number of flights. The pilots had to do 6 to 7 missions a day. The most we can do at the moment in the north is to give any speedy help that we can give. We sent submarines to intercept German traffic on the Arctic coast and a mine layer with various supplies to Archangel. We are also studying, as a further development, the basing of some British fighter air squadrons in Murmansk. On July the 23rd, 1941, Churchill ordered preparations for sending 2 squadrons of Hurricane fighters to Russia.
And we saw it at first hand, the way that the Germans were going through Russia, and obviously they had to be helped. But then that worked 2 ways, because at the back end of the war, we, the Allies, would have been in a lot of trouble.
The operation was called Force Benedict. The main objectives of the campaign were, firstly, the transfer and assistance in mastering British Hurricane fighters by Soviet pilots, and secondly, taking active part in the defense of Murmansk. The loss of this ice-free port would endanger the supply of military assistance from Britain and the US. On July the 28th, 1941, in a hangar at Leakenfield Airfield in the East Riding of Yorkshire, 500 people gathered. 38 of them were fighter pilots. The rest were members of the crew, mechanics and staff. Nobody knew why they were there. Some of them had been recalled from combat units, some from vacation and some from the reserve. The rumor was that they had to take part in some secret mission. But what, when, and most importantly where this mission would take place, nobody knew. It was the birth of a new Royal Air Force tactical unit, the 151st Wing.
That was in Birmingham, in Bourneville, where your chocolate is made. And I'd only been there a day, and the police came to the door. A telegram saying that I was to report back to my unit immediately.
The 151st Wing consisted of the 81st and the 134th Squadrons, under the command of Majors Rooke and Miller. Almost all the pilots had combat experience. Some reported shooting down German airplanes, and some were shot down and had to escape burning planes. They were all young, with an average age of 21. Their nationalities were very diverse. There were English, Scots, Welsh, Canadians, Australians, Polish, 1 Rhodesian and 1 Irishman. Sergeant Hoare, nicknamed Wag, called the wing a League of Nations. The wing commander was Colonel Henry Neville Gaines, Ramsbottom-Isherwood of New Zealand.
He was a very good commander. He kept himself away from us until something was important. And he came and briefed us.
A sign of respect for the commander and his authority was the fact that none of the 151st Wing pilots, not even Sergeant Hoare, one of the best fighters, known for his endless jokes and tricks as a wag, had a go at the commander's surname, Ramsbottom. Charlton Hoare joined the Royal Air Force in 1939. In the Battle of Britain, he shot down a Messerschmitt 110, but was shot down himself in his Hurricane over Bristol. Meticulous, dedicated, he had a great sense of humour. The next day, Colonel Isherwood gathered everyone in the dormitory and announced the task was secret. Therefore, all leaves were cancelled, exit from the base was prohibited, and letters would be censored. Yes, and there was more. All had to get tropical uniforms and vaccinations against malaria and ague. A few days later, the commander admitted to the pilots that the tropical uniform and vaccination was a decoy. They would be sent to the north of the Soviet Union, to Murmansk, the place everyone except the Russians call Icy Hell. Canadian Jimmy Walker could not contain himself and exclaimed, "Oh my God!" Hoare immediately responded, "Indeed, you spoke for us all."
We wanted to get out in the cold, you see. We were keen to head where the action was. When we heard it was Russia, that was great.
Some of the pilots were sent by the comfortable former cruise liner, the SS Landstefan Castle, the largest ship which became part of the first Allied Dervish convoy. Since Murmansk could be captured at any time, the convoy headed for Archangel. The most pleasant part was not the comfort of the cruise liner accommodation, but the fact that the ship, before sailing to England, managed to replenish food stocks in South Africa. During the war, British soldiers didn't starve, but their diet was very, very poor. But here, pilots had practically unlimited jam, grapefruit, butter, eggs, meat and fish. They had a feeling that their war life was getting better.
You were having a very, very rough time in 1941. The Germans were advancing all over Russia, as you probably know. And we were sent to help. We were told that we must not let Murmansk fall at all costs.
In late August, non-flying weather settled in for a long time. Safanov set up a shooting range at the edge of the airfield. German aircraft parts were used as targets. Shots were fired at different angles and from different ranges. It turned out that firing from further away than 300 to 400 meters, the bullets only left dents in the targets. The range should be much closer for a kill shot. Junkers 88s and Messerschmitt 110 aircraft are quite robust, and shooting them further away than 300 meters was useless. The rounds dispersed and the chances of hitting them were low. So I first and foremost tried to close up to 200 meters, and sometimes even closer. Where to aim? I used to shoot at the pilot, but he started to maneuver, so I became a target for his gunner. Now I take out the gunner first. He's closer to the plane's tail and easier to reach. Once the gunner is dealt with, it's the end. Due to constant head-turning in combat, pilots chafed their necks against their leather collars. Safanov equipped his entire squadron with silk scarves. He always paid a lot of attention to detail. He cut off all fasteners on his flight helmet, replacing them with press studs because it's faster. For convenience, his parachute system hung on a birch branch next to his plane. On receipt of the departure order, it took Safanov just 60 seconds to start taxiing. In early August, Safanov in his I-16 had a battle with two Messerschmitts. Suddenly, out of the clouds, a third enemy plane emerged. Safanov imitated panic. Boris suddenly slowed down and allowed the Messer to slip past him. To catch the enemy in sight and to release his armor-piercing rounds was for Safanov a matter of technique. On August the 9th, Safanov's squadron takes off to intercept 60 German bombers and fighters that are trying to break through to the Northern Fleet bases in Vaenga. 2 days later, the Soviet Information Bureau reported the largest air raid attempt by German and Finnish planes on the Murmansk area spectacularly failed. During the air combat, Soviet fighters shot down 13 German-Finnish bombers. 3 of the enemy aircraft were shot down by anti-aircraft artillery. By the end of August 1941, Boris Safanov had completed 130 sorties and had shot down 11 enemy aircraft. At that time, he was the highest-scoring Soviet fighter pilot of the Great Patriotic War. Newspapers mentioned him a lot. There's even a joke. In the sky, he attacks the Nazis, and on the land, he's attacked by journalists. The Northern Fleet's political department prints a leaflet titled, "To smash the enemy, do it Safanov's way." On the 31st of August, the Dervish ship's convoy entered the mouth of the Northern Dwina and anchored at Archangel. For security reasons, none of the port's management was aware of the convoy's approach. That's why for 2 kilometers along the landing pier, the walls were stacked with wood, scrap metal and containers. For 3 days, all the port workers, Archangel's technical college students and British pilots cleaned up the area in readiness for the cargo of 15 Hurricanes to be safely unloaded to shore. From Archangel, part of the British group was sent to Murmansk on a military transport ship, the Douglas. The majority was picked up by 2 British destroyers. Hundreds of others headed to Murmansk by train. They were told that it wouldn't take long, about 3 days. However, food rations were given for a week, and they were right. The train to Murmansk took exactly 7 days. At a small station, the wagon containing British soldiers halted for more than an hour opposite a Soviet hospital train. A cultural exchange quickly ensued. Russian soldiers in bandages and dressings were smiling and putting their thumbs up. In return, the British taught them the V gesture for victory. The only airfield in Archangel is on the island of Kego, just a mile from the city centre. At that time, it was the largest airport in the region. There was a huge airfield and a harbour for the seaplanes to land in. It was here, right on the beach, where the boxes of Hurricane planes were unloaded. Now all 30 British technicians, led by Engineer Lieutenant Gittins, had to assemble them in no time. The British pilots and technicians were accommodated nearby on board an ancient paddle steamer, the Ivan Kalaev. They called it the Missouri Scow. Obviously, the nickname was inspired by Mark Twain's romantic stories. However, on the first night, bedbugs dispelled the romantic mood and returned them to the realities of the Soviet Arctic. Luckily, the bug problem was sorted out quickly. Once the boxes with planes were opened, it turned out that the cargo had been negligently packed. Almost half of the tools needed to assemble the Hurricane aircraft had been left in Liverpool. Lieutenant Engineer Gittins handed over the sketch drawings of all the tools required to his Soviet colleagues, and in less than a day, at the Red Blacksmith production plant, the new tool sets were made, including unique keys for mounting the Hurricane's propeller. It's a coincidence that later it will be reported back to London. The Russians are capable of working 14 hours in the pouring rain without any technical documentation and standard tools. They do it very efficiently.
The Russians made a spanner during the night. So the following morning, they got a spanner fitted.
9 days later, all 15 Hurricanes, thanks to the British and Soviet technicians, were ready. The pilots were confident in the assembly quality. They were mainly concerned about the available fuel quality. The high-octane gasoline, compatible with Hurricane airplanes, was delayed in delivery.
I'd flown up from Archangel to Vyanga, and I was very, very short of petrol. And I know the chap on the end of the runway was there with a red pistol. Do you know what a red area light is? So it's a gun with different colours in when you fire it. I kept getting a red light that I was landing to in Bug or something there. A third time I was nearly out of petrol and I got a red light and I thought, never mind your red light, I'm coming in. And I did come in, I did land quite well.
On the 7th of September, the 72nd Soviet Mixed Wing was moved to the nearby airfield of Vyanga 2. Vyanga 1, as the most prepared airfield, was given to the British pilots. Vyanga 1 was built just before the war, so by September 1941, there was nothing here except a long runway, no hangars, no carponiers or taxiways. However, the landmarks for landing were very distinct. One end of the landing strip was against the lake, and the other end against the Kola Bay.
I was never able to ring the ground and say, give me a vector for home, because you just couldn't get it. It wouldn't work. So what we had to do was fly out to sea, look at the coastline, and then work out where you were from the coastline, and then get to Vyanga that way. That was the only way. Otherwise, it was just ice and snow.
There were no hangars at Vyanga Airfield, but shelter for the Hurricanes was very much needed. Wing Commander Ramsbottom-Isherwood pointed that out to the accompanying Soviet general. No problem, was the reply. There'll be shelters. When? Tomorrow afternoon. Soon after, thousands of workers dressed in black came out of the forest. They were armed with saws, shovels and axes. Very quickly they dug spaces in the hills, covering them with a roof made of birch planks and turf. When the work was done, they simply melted into the forest as suddenly as they had appeared. Of course, everyone guessed who those people were. The wag Sergeant Hawk joked, "Remind me if I forget, never to join a group of Russian workers.
All around the airfield, they had these holes built into the cliffside, and the Hurricanes were run back into these holes, and then the curtains were drawn across the front, and you could not see them from outside, so it was very good camouflage.
For the best protection of the airfield buildings in case of enemy air raids, they were spread around. The HQ, pilots' billet, canteen and club and dugouts for the technical staff were placed a mile from each other. It took some time to move between the facilities, and the road connecting them was of the normal British standard. The British had to learn gruntovka and tropinka, the Russian words for gravel and park. During the rains, the surface of the runway degraded into potholes, and the central part of the airfield got washed out. The British joked, at Vaenga, experienced pilots must be careful only in two cases, during takeoff and landing. On September the 8th, the Germans began their third most powerful attack on Murmansk, but again stumbled on Soviet defenses. Aviation could drive the Red Army out of the fortifications, so the Luftwaffe command threw 100 bombers into the battle. The main task was to cut off Murmansk from the battle line. The Soviet interceptor fighters were battling at their limits. The sky boiled from long hours of dogfights, as military pilots call them. The Germans failed to destroy bridges. Ammunition supplies from Murmansk continued to come to the battlefront. Using surviving roads, the 3rd Polar Division, formed from sailors and prisoners, easily reinforced the battlefield. On the 11th of September, British pilots were introduced to the operations area layout. During the day, groups of 4 Hurricanes flew to the battle line. The best trained pilots from Boris-Safanov's squadron led these groups. Once on the way back, one of the British pilots took the lead. By tipping his Hurricane wings, he warned the group leader, Zakharov, Messerschmitts are on the right. Then he rushed off to intercept them. The others naturally followed him. The Germans avoided the battle and turned west. This incident made it clear to Soviet pilots that the British were determined to fight, and avoiding engagement was not in their plans. That night, all of us, pilots of the Northern Fleet and the British, were in a wonderful mood. Here, in the harsh Arctic, over the leaden waves of the Barents Sea, above the granite hills, each of us was defending our homeland, Moscow and London. We were firmly convinced of it.
There were 5 of us in the air when we hit upon the Germans. You wouldn't believe it. All the officers were so cross because they'd been sitting down all morning. We'd only just come out to relieve them from lunch, and we got the baking. We were singled out for attack.
Smoke puffs from the anti-aircraft guns pointed British pilots in the direction of the enemy aircraft. There were 6 Junkers 87 and 1 Henschel 126. They were attacked by I-16 Soviet fighters from Safonov's squadron. For them, it was the second fight of the day. The Soviet aircraft were low on fuel, and 5 German Messerschmitt fighters and 1 Henschel 126 were approaching from the west. The British help came just in time. Hoare attacked first. The rounds of 12 Hurricane machine guns dug into the Messerschmitt wings. The enemy's aircraft wreckage crashed to the ground in a ball of fire. Suddenly, one of the Hurricanes started pouring smoke and dived towards the ground. It was Hoare's fighter friend Norman Smith. Hoare saw the hole in the cockpit and the fire. Smith tried to open the canopy, but to no avail. He couldn't get out, and there was no place for an emergency landing. Hoare's plane accompanied Smith right to the end. Smith, just 20 years old, was buried with military honours the next day on September the 13th. The coffin was covered with a Union Jack handmade by the Soviet military. Smith's funeral was attended by a large number of locals. Sergeant Hoare, Smith's countryman, also from Yorkshire, remembered his phrase, "If I die and you guys fight badly, I'll get out of the grave and we'll give you such a kicking." Hoare then continued, "Don't worry, we'll fight so hard you'll never have to do it." After a sudden September snowstorm, a thaw came. Vyanga turned into a mud bath. For the aircraft not to dip their noses during taxiing, 2 mechanics were put on the plane's tail. They had to jump off on the pilot's orders just before takeoff. On September the 27th, Lieutenant Vic Berg, suffering from fatigue, forgot to give the command. He throttled his plane on the runway with the mechanics Ridley and Thomas sitting on the back. They couldn't jump off. Shortly after, the plane misbalanced and crashed. Vic Berg was wounded, but Ridley and Thomas didn't survive. For the entire week, the German army tried to break through to Murmansk, to no avail. General Dietl makes a decision to throw all aviation available against the Soviet line of defense. It seemed to the Soviet soldiers that enemy aircraft were permanently hanging over the battlefront line. To defend the skies, 7 Northern Fleet interceptor fighters, led by Boris Safanov, took off. It soon became clear forces were uneven. 7 Soviet planes faced 32 German bombers and 20 fighters. Safanov gives the command to form a flying circus. In this formation, the group performs a horizontal turn, and each pilot covers the tail of the one in front. 4 German planes had already been shot down when Kovalenko signaled to Safanov about Messerschmitt's closing up. Safanov got his group together and flew us towards the enemy. The Germans were flying in pairs, aiming for a head-on attack. Enemy rounds flew by both sides of my plane. We didn't break, the Germans did. Their formation crumbled. September the 16th, 1941. Moscow sends good news. Captain Safanov, by the Presidium of the Supreme Council decree, is given the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, and his 72nd Aviation Squadron is awarded the Order of the Red Banner. When mastering the Hurricane, Boris Safanov used the principle of one-to-one training. Together with Major Tony Miller, the commander of the 134th Squadron and translator, they climbed all over the plane prior to takeoff. Only then did Safanov climb into the cockpit and began to ask about the avionics, devices, and engineering installations. Afterwards, he addressed Major Miller through the interpreter. Am I correct that, after about 15 minutes of Safanov's questioning, Major Miller interrupted him and said to Captain Safanov that he could fly the Hurricane with confidence?
The flying skills are no problem once you understand the instruments, and usually the instruments only come in if you're blind flying. But flying at the Hurricane for Captain Safanov, no problem whatsoever. I've seen that man fly in conditions that a lot of our pilots would have not flown in.
Then, one of the Hurricanes taxied to the takeoff point. Safanov, dressed in his flying suit, got in. The British poured onto the airfield to see the flight of the Soviet pilot. Safanov took off and flew the Hurricane into the air on his first flight. He climbed to 450 meters with landing gear down, made 3 circles over the airfield and then landed. The impression of the first flight was a bit marred by a slightly awkward landing. However, when Safanov taxied to the parking place, he jumped off the wing into the hands of British pilots, who began tossing him into the air while shouting, "All right, Safon! Very good, Safon!" In the British pilots' diaries, there are repeated notes about the high quality of provisions provided to them by the Soviet allies. Especially, they commented on fresh eggs and ham, not knowing that by this time, Archangel and even more so Murmansk were starving.
But the food on the first day when we arrived there was something we remember, because it was we had caviar, we had smoked salmon, we had ham, we had a big barrel of wine, we had everything, but this didn't last.
Once, the British staff said that they would bring and collect cutlery and dishes to make it easier for the canteen staff. Their offer was refused. When they asked why, someone smart said, "Do you bring your own tea, milk and sugar with you when you go visiting people?" The first snow covered Vaenga in September and considerably complicated both landing and takeoff. This added new impressions and joy to the everyday routine of wartime.
Twice a week to be clean, because there was no water where we were living, and took water with a blow lamp, and you need a lot of snow to get a pint of water. So it was heaven to get to this bathhouse, and the drill was to take a shower, and then 20 minutes or a quarter of an hour in the steam room, and then go and roll in the snow.
The first of the British who decided to experience a Russian banya, a steam sauna, were Hoare and Carter. Taking with them a change of clothes, they jumped into the truck and in 20 minutes arrived at Vaenga village, though later Carter commented that they didn't miss any bumps along the way.
The amusing thing was that there was young ladies, well, they weren't very young, but ladies that used to look after the place, and they had sticks. Do you know what a witch's broom is? Yeah, they used to slap our buttons with these sticks.
And looking after this bathhouse was an elderly lady, but she was very quick, and she had a do you know what a birch is? The birch to beat with, and she had great fun in chasing these 20-year-old RAF virile airmen round the what they beat in the life out of them, and she'd shriek. So we teased her, you know, and I'm sure she was very sorry when we went.
At Vaenga, Soviet pilots for the first time came across the favourite British game of darts. Having no idea about the game and its rules, all of them decided that it was an aircraft simulator for developing accuracy. Russians aimed for the bullseye and did it with huge gusto. The British found it funny, but the Allied soldiers' throws bent almost all the darts' tips. Only then did the British confess that this was a game and you had to throw like this. The Soviets immediately lost interest in darts. England could easily have landed 25 to 30 divisions in Archangel, or moved them through Iran to the southern regions of the USSR for military cooperation with the Soviet troops. Sadly, Britain had neither transport to send 30 divisions to Russia, nor 450,000 soldiers to form these divisions. In conversation with Soviet Ambassador Mr. Maisky, Churchill honestly admitted, in the next 5 to 6 weeks, only God can help you. However, you don't believe in him. The situation in the USSR was estimated by the British as critical. Kyiv surrendered. Leningrad was completely cut off by land from the rest of the country. From the British intelligence reports, Churchill knew that very soon the Wehrmacht would begin an attack on Moscow. On the 22nd of September 1941, Churchill was working all day with his drawer, as he called his archive. That's when the Royal Air Force Chief of Staff's report drew his attention. It stated that on the 20th of that month, in the sky over Murmansk, British Hurricanes shot down 3 German Messerschmitts, with no aircraft losses on their side. The Prime Minister called it one of the few joyful events of the last few days.
The other flights, we were escorting the PE-2 Russian bombers, which were very good people, very good aircraft, and they bombed. We waited till they bombed and protected them on the way back, and they never lost a bomber when we were escorting them, which was, I think, a very good thing, even though we were attacked.
On September the 28th, British pilots received an order to accompany Soviet bombers in a raid on the bridge across the river Pechinga. The bridge was a strategic point, as it allowed the Germans to supply fuel, machinery and reinforcements to their group near Murmansk. While the bridge was intact, Murmansk was in danger. The Hurricanes were protecting the Soviet bombers. It's worth mentioning that the bridge was bombed more than once before to no avail. Striking the bridge was very difficult. It was defended well with anti-aircraft guns and fighters. This time the Soviets came up with an unexpected approach. Various scientists were working in the Soviet Army headquarters in the Arctic. Geologists, hydrologists and soil analysts. They suggested striking not the bridge, but the riverbank to cause a landslide. "3 million cubic meters of soil slid into the river along a kilometer stretch. This caused a tidal wave, and the 100 meters long wooden bridge was crushed like a matchbox. It was the first time in history that the supply of a whole army was interrupted by a man-made natural disaster. German troops got stuck in the freezing tundra for 11 days. The Wehrmacht's objective to take over Murmansk before the winter came was unsuccessful.
Coming back from a bombing raid, we formated upon them, came up very close, and they thought this was very funny, so they all went in very close, and wingtip to wingtip, and that was the only joke we had.
Unexpectedly, in the porthole of one of the Soviet bombers, British pilots spotted the joyful face of Corporal Flockhart, the 151st Wings Carpenter. He was sitting in the gunner's place, was also the radio operator in the airplane returning from the air raid. It remained a mystery how Flockhart, who didn't know a word of Russian, made his way to the closed British airfield of Vaenga 2 and convinced Soviet pilots to take him on board. Flockhart just silently smiled when someone asked him about it. Colonel Ramsbottom-Isherwood later told him, "I admire what you did. It was really great. However, if the bomber in which you were flying had got shot down, you would have put me in an extremely awkward position." On the 1st of October 1941, Vaenga 1 airfield was getting ready to greet a large group of military correspondents. The Kremlin had finally decided to use the presence of the British Allies as an example of the successful cooperation between the USSR and the UK. Before this, the British presence hadn't been mentioned. Famous Soviet writers such as Konstantin Simonov and Yuri Gehrman accompanied the delegation. Photographers Michael Bernstein and Eugen Halday tortured British patients for some time. They were taking shots around the Hurricanes on the airfield on a sunny but frosty day. The British pilots were freezing and shivering, but they kept smiling. At first, the correspondents were puzzled by one of the Soviet pilots' words. "We're friendly with the British. We rip off each other's uniform buttons," and then revealed that both Allied sides were big fans of souvenirs. On the English uniform, Soviet stars, insignia and signs of arms sparkled. The journalists had nothing to do but to turn out their pockets and to add to the collection of the British Museum, as the British pilots joked. On October the 6th, 1941, the Germans bombed Vajenga airfield for the first time. The bombs burst on the landing strip and next to the barracks.
That was my day off. Nowhere to go, so I was down on the airfield. So I said to my crew, it's safer up there than down here. I ran to my aeroplane and took off while the thing was being bombed. They Russians thought I was a good thing. Quite honestly, it was safer to be up in the air.
3 Hurricanes from different attack angles assaulted a German bomber and soon set it on fire. Safanov's squadron shot down 1 more Junkers. The Germans were haphazardly bombing so they could return to their front line. The Hurricanes and I-16 interceptors pursued them. At the same time, a group of 6 Hurricanes returning from their free hunting saw the enemy Junkers and joined the battle. The enemy bombers were caught in a crossfire. The commander of the 134th Squadron, Major Rook, got so carried away pursuing the enemy that he was separated from the rest of the group. Having spotted a group of fighters, Rook thought they were Hurricanes. Closing up, he saw the crosses on the airplane wings. They were Messerschmitt 109s. One of the German pilots started firing. Rook dodged the attack and replied with a volley from his 12 machine guns. The German fighter exploded in the air. 1 Brit against 4 German Messers. He didn't have a chance. The Germans turned and rushed away towards the clouds. A group of MiG interceptors, led by Captain Kukharenko, came to help Rook. Together, they all returned to Vajenga 1. The outcome of this air battle was recorded in the documents of the Soviet Northern Fleet Air Force. 2 Junkers were shot down by Soviet pilots, and 2 Junkers and a Messerschmitt 109 were shot down by the British pilots. Also, the British pilots claimed 10 damaged Junkers. These were the last German aircraft taken down by RAF pilots in the Murmansk area. Now the 151st Wing could begin its main purpose of becoming the centre for mastering the British Hurricanes. Each pilot and technician was given only 5 days to do it. All the instructions were in English, and all measurements were in miles, pounds and gallons. All the translations, recalculations and relearning were done on the spot.
Who were learning to techniques for the Hurricane so that they could go back and train their pupils, their students, and these were very experienced officers. We had Safonov, we had Kukharenko, we had Rodin, very nice people, very friendly.
Safonov started flying the Hurricane. He took it to the edge. When asked why by his commander, he answered, "Of course, it's necessary. How can I put young pilots into this plane if I don't know what it's capable of?"
Safonov, a very good pilot. He knew all about our engines, our aircraft engines. He always came down to see what we were doing with them, when we were maintaining them. And I think he liked them. As far as we knew, he liked them.
Pilots and technicians' exams were administered by the strictest British chief engineer of the 151st Wing, Lieutenant Gittins. Soviet Allied personnel passed all tests with an average of 80 out of 100. Gittins said that for such a short period of time, only 2 people could achieve such high scores, him and the Minister of Aviation, Sinclair, and no one else.
Mostly the Russians were, the pilots were, don't mind the instructions, just go off and do it. And they'd fly in any condition. They'd fly in thick fog and then in thick fog. They were a little mad. But all they wanted to do was get up and kill.
We handed everything over to the Russians, including our flying gear. Everything. Just get our personal things like toothbrush and that sort of thing. Towels.
Tim Elkington asked Sergeant Romanov to give him the logbook. In the aircraft transfer column, he recorded, "The undersigned, namely Sergeant Peter Daniel Romanov, is now the proud possessor of a very fine fighter aircraft." The British hadn't left yet, and the Soviet pilots had already started to shoot down German planes using British aircraft. On October the 25th, 15 German Junkers bombed Soviet troops on the bridge across the River Ura. The pilots of the recently formed 78th Aviation Fighter Regiment took off to intercept them. Lieutenant Diamin Sinyov became the first Soviet pilot to shoot down a German plane flying a Hurricane. On the 20th of October, Ramsbottom-Isherwood sent a telegram to London. All aircraft have been transferred to the Soviets. A reply from the ministry stated all personnel should get ready to head back to the British Isles. From now on, the 151st Wing ceases to be a separate combat entity, and the Russian skies will be defended by Russians themselves, using Hurricanes. From the end of 41 to the beginning of 43, Hurricanes were the most widely used fighter planes by Soviet pilots to defend the Arctic. By 1943, it was no longer as advanced as before, giving way to the more modern and more powerful Spitfire. Nevertheless, it was Hurricanes that carried the main burden of intercepting German aviation raids and covering Allied convoys during the first half of the Great Patriotic War. In the summer and autumn of 1941, the Arctic was where the Luftwaffe failed to reach domination in the air. During the period of the most active military actions, from the 22nd of June to November the 1st, 1941, 151 German airplanes were shot down in air battles above the Arctic. The Soviet losses for the same period amounted to 125 aircraft, including losses as a result of accidents and technical problems. On November the 24th, the remaining British pilots and mechanics left Vaenga airfield for Murmansk on 3 British warships accompanied by the icebreaker Lenin and moved out to the open sea. All of a sudden, from over the hills, the group saw 12 Hurricanes with red stars on their wings. They were flying a distinctive formation used only by the Royal Air Force. The group leader was Major Boris Safanov. Officially, the group's flight log stated giving air cover to ships. However, everyone knew the Russians couldn't resist saying goodbye. All personnel of the 151st Wing crowded onto the deck. The British were waving and shouting, "Das Vidanya, das Vidanya." The Soviets again and again went low above the ships while they had enough fuel. And then all aircraft banked up sharply and disappeared into the clouds. In March 1942, Major Boris Safanov, Captains Ivan Tumanov, Alexei Kukharenko and Alexander Kovalenko were awarded British Distinguished Flying Crosses for their outstanding flying merit. It was the first and the only time this award was given to Soviet military personnel. The commander of the 151st Wing, Ramsbottom-Isherwood, and squadron commanders Rook and Miller, and the most outstanding pilot Sergeant Hoare, were granted the highest Soviet award, the Order of Lenin. It was also the only case when British military personnel were given this award. After the 151st Wing was disbanded, the 134th Wing and the 81st Squadron continued their combat elsewhere. Per ardua valabimus, "We fly over the difficulties," was the motto of the 134th Wing. After their air battles in the sky above the Soviet Union, their emblem changed its color. It became red in memory of the battles. The 81st Squadron chose the Red Star crossed with a sword as their emblem. They also brought their motto from the Arctic, "Non solum nobis," not only for us.
We were all overwhelmed with the generosity. Everything we received from the Russian people, they were tremendous. And it's something that I will never ever forget, and I'm sure my colleagues will never forget it either. The Russian people were tremendous, and something we will remember all my days.
Operation False Benedict came to a close. Of course, on the scale of the great battles of the Second World War, it was just a small episode. But the memory of the Polar Brotherhood of the Soviet and British pilots forever lives on in this vast and icy corner of the earth.
Скорей домой, спеши, конвой, нелегкий долг исполнен твой. Тебе крылом махнут друзья в небесной синеве скользя. Родной Британии холмы, встречайте нас, вернулись мы. Храните вечно имена всех тех, кого взяла война. Храните вечно имена всех тех, кого взяла война.